The autumn had arrived, not as a season, but as a creditor. It came for the Waverley house in stages. First the hedgerows along the eastern garden wall went brown and brittle, then the roses that Eleanor's mother had planted the year before. Her death surrendered their last pale blooms to the wind. Then the downstairs fires were reduced to one, then half of one, as if warmth itself had become a luxury the Waverleys could no longer sustain. Eleanor noticed. She always noticed. It was, she had come to understand, the particular burden of invisible people. They saw everything, because no one thought to hide anything from them. She stood at the tall window of the morning room. Her mother's room once, before it had been quietly absorbed into her stepmother's orbit, and watched the oak leaves detach themselves one by one from the great tree at the edge of the lawn, each one falling with a kind of dignified resignation that she recognized and did not name. She was 26 years old. She had a small allowance, a smaller wardrobe, and the kind of usefulness that made her indispensable and simultaneously invisible. She kept the household accounts. She ordered the menus. She drafted the letters that her stepmother signed with a flourish. She reminded her half-sister Cecily of appointments, of names, of the correct fork. And she did all of this in grey and lavender, in soft dove-coloured wool and faded silk, because she had learned quite early that the world arranged itself more comfortably if she did not insist on being noticed. From the hall below came Cecily's laughter, bright and cascading, the kind of laughter that required an audience and generally found one. At 22, Cecily Waverley was considered one of the great beauties of the county, perhaps of the season. She had their mother's colouring, people said. Or rather, people said this to Eleanor as a kind of consolation, as if proximity to her mother's beauty ought to be sufficient. Eleanor had her father's eyes, which were kind and unremarkable, and her father's hands, which were capable and often cold from the draughts in rooms where the fire was kept low. She had been told she was plain. She had been told this so many times and in so many registers, pitying, dismissive, affectionate, competitive, that she had simply absorbed it the way a house absorbs damp, silently, thoroughly, without comment. She turned from the window when she heard her stepmother's voice on the stairs, sharp and purposeful. Lady Miriam Waverley moved through rooms as though they had been arranged for her particular benefit, which in most cases they had been, by Eleanor, who arranged everything. "Where are you?" Lady Miriam called, and there was a particular quality to the call, a barely restrained excitement underneath the demand, that made Eleanor set down the household ledger she had been carrying and step into the hall. "Here," Eleanor said. Lady Miriam appeared at the landing, Cecily 2 steps behind her, both of them lit with the bright, restless energy of women who have received extraordinary news and are still deciding how best to deploy it. "There is to be a dinner," Lady Miriam said without preamble, "at the Ashmore estate, tomorrow evening." She paused, as people pause when they believe what they are about to say will produce a dramatic effect. "Prince Aldrich will be in attendance." Eleanor absorbed this information the way she absorbed most information, quietly, with attention, without expression. Prince Aldrich. The name was known to every household in England, though the man himself was known to almost none. He was the king's younger brother, the second son, a prince who had spent the last 4 years abroad, in diplomatic postings and military attachments that were described in the papers in terms too vague to be fully believed, and who had returned to England 2 months prior to a great deal of public curiosity and almost no public appearances. He was said to be formidable. He was said to be cold. He was said to be extraordinarily handsome in the particular way of men who do not notice or particularly care that they are handsome, which was considered either magnetic or unnerving depending on one's disposition. He was also, the papers had lately suggested, in need of a wife. The reasons were the usual ones: dynastic obligation, the king's advancing age, the need for heirs and anchors, and the appearance of settled domesticity. but there was a particular urgency to the reports that suggested something beyond the usual pressure of royal obligation. Something, it was widely speculated, had happened. Something that had made the prince's situation more complicated than it appeared. Lady Miriam was still speaking. Lord Ashmore has specifically extended an invitation to the family, she was saying, and the word family was weighted in a way that made its actual meaning clear. Cecily. I have already spoken to Madame Vellier about Cecily's gown, the ivory satin, I think, with the pearl drops, and I will need you to— Shall I come? Eleanor asked. Lady Miriam blinked. It was, Eleanor reflected, a testament to something, habit, perhaps, or her own successful invisibility, that the question had genuinely not occurred to her stepmother. I suppose, Lady Miriam said, in the tone of a woman making a minor logistical concession. You may come. Wear the grey. Eleanor looked at her. I always wear the grey, she said. Yes, said Lady Miriam, and turned away. Cecily caught Eleanor's eye and offered the smile she kept for private use, the one that was slightly too satisfied to be kind. I'm sure you'll be very useful, she said sweetly, and followed her mother back up the stairs. Eleanor stood in the hall a moment longer, her hands quiet at her sides, the ledger held loosely against her hip. She had learned long ago that tears were exactly what they wanted, and so she did not offer them. She looked out through the hall window at the denuded oak, at the grey and patient sky, and thought, tomorrow. Then she went to see about dinner. The Ashmore estate was 20 minutes by carriage and a world apart in every sense that mattered. It was the kind of house that had never known anything so commonplace as decline. Its stones were clean, its fires generous, its servants innumerable and exquisitely trained. Eleanor arrived in grey, as instructed, and was assigned her place at the outer edge of the receiving line with the quiet efficiency of someone whose position in the evening required no particular announcement. She did not mind. She was accustomed to the vantage of edges, and from edges one saw most clearly. The room filled with the usual machinery of a great dinner, the rustle of silk, the glint of jewels, the performance of ease practiced until it became almost genuine. Cecily moved through it like a planet drawing lesser bodies into her orbit, beautiful and certain of it, the ivory satin exactly right, the pearl drops catching the candlelight with exquisite precision. She was, Eleanor thought without bitterness, genuinely magnificent to look at. The miracle of beauty was that it required no effort to appreciate it, even when it was inconvenient. There was a shift in the room, a particular quality of attention, a collective reorientation of posture and gaze, the kind that precedes the arrival of someone whose presence changes the atmosphere of a place. Prince Aldrich entered from the far door with Lord Ashmore at his side, and Eleanor, who had no expectation of being struck by anything this evening, found herself quietly surprised. He was tall enough that the room arranged itself differently around him, and his face was precisely what the papers had failed to adequately describe. It was not conventionally beautiful. It was more serious than that, more weathered, with the quality of a landscape that has endured all seasons and kept its essential character through all of them. His eyes, which she could not have named a colour from her distance, were attentive in a way she recognized, the attentiveness of someone who was watching rather than performing. He moved without the peacock consciousness of men who knew themselves to be observed. He seemed, she thought, tired, not in the body, but in some deeper register, tired in the way of someone who had been performing composure for a very long time and had become so proficient at the performance that he could no longer entirely distinguish it from the real thing. He was seated at the head of the table, and the dinner began, and Eleanor found her place at the far end beside Lord Ashmore's elderly aunt, a sharp-eyed woman named Lady Constance, who had opinions on everything and shared them freely. "You're the elder Miss Waverley," Lady Constance said, not unkindly, studying Eleanor with the directness of someone who had long since concluded that pretense was an inefficiency. Yes, ma'am, Eleanor said. The useful one, Lady Constance said. Eleanor considered this. I suppose so, she said. Better to be useful than ornamental, Lady Constance said. Ornaments get sold when the money runs out. Useful things are kept. She turned back to her soup with the satisfaction of a woman who has said something true, and Eleanor found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the corner of her mouth had moved. From her position at the table's far end, Eleanor could see the whole length of the room. She could see Cecily, 3 seats to Prince Aldrich's right, deployed to maximum effect, laughing at something the man to her left had said in a way that was designed to be observed by the man at the head. She could see Lady Miriam, 2 seats beyond, monitoring the operation with the vigilance of a general. She could see, and this was the detail she had not anticipated, that Prince Aldrich was not watching Cecily. His attention moved, as the meal progressed, in the careful, methodical way of someone who was assessing rather than admiring. He spoke to those beside him with the grave courtesy of a man performing a social obligation he found neither offensive nor particularly enlivening. He accepted the attention of the room without appearing to solicit or enjoy it. And once, only once, near the dessert course, his gaze travelled the full length of the table and found Eleanor. It was a glance of perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, too brief to be interpreted with any confidence. He looked at her with the quality of a man who had seen something unexpected and was deciding whether to look again. She met his eyes without flinching, because she had learned that looking away invited conclusions about weakness. And then the conversation at his end of the table reclaimed him. And the moment passed. The world closed over it like water. It was afterward, in the hallway near the cloakroom, that the evening delivered what Eleanor had not expected. She had gone to fetch Cecily's wrap, because that was the kind of thing she fetched, and she was crossing back through the corridor when she heard Cecily's voice around the corner, bright and private, meant only for the friend she was confiding in. She is perfectly harmless, Cecily was saying, meaning Eleanor, because the she required no name. She runs around doing things, that's what she does. You needn't pay any attention to her. Nobody does. Honestly, I think she prefers it. Can you imagine? And here Cecily laughed, the real laugh, the private one, the one that held no warmth at all. Can you imagine anyone actually choosing her? She's been useful for so long she doesn't even remember there might be another option. Eleanor stood in the corridor with the wrap in her hands. She was still. Her face did not change. She had heard worse. She had heard things said with far more artistry and far more cruelty, and she had absorbed them all with the same practiced stillness, because the stillness was the thing she had that they could not take. She waited until the voices moved away. Then she continued down the corridor, delivered the wrap, and said nothing. She did not tell herself that the glance had meant anything. She was not, by nature or by experience, a woman given to hope on small grounds. She had been trained out of such indulgences by years of steady disappointment, and she had come to understand that the body's small surges of meaning, the quickened breath, the held gaze, the sense that something was about to change, were not prophecy. They were chemistry, or wishfulness, or the simple human error of pattern recognition applied to coincidence. She noted the glance. She filed it away in the part of her mind that kept careful records of everything and promised nothing. She woke the next morning, assisted with the accounting, wrote 3 letters, ordered the winter stores, and did not think about Prince Aldrich. She was, therefore, entirely unprepared for the card that arrived 2 days later. It came with the morning post, tucked between a bill from the linen merchant and a social note from Lady Ashmore, and it bore a seal she recognized before she could have said how she recognized it. She handed it to Lady Miriam without opening it, because it was addressed to the Waverley household and not to her specifically, and she stood at the edge of the morning room while her stepmother broke the seal with hands that had gone noticeably unsteady. The card read, Lady Miriam reported in a voice stripped briefly of its usual authority. Prince Aldrich requested the pleasure of calling upon the Waverley household on Thursday, with the intention of addressing a matter of some personal significance. He hoped the family would receive him. The morning room was very quiet. "It's Cecily," Lady Miriam said at last, and her voice had recovered itself, had rebuilt its certainty on the foundation of what seemed to her the only possible interpretation. It must be Cecily. He noticed her at dinner. How could he not? And now... She pressed her hand to her chest with a kind of grateful relief, and Cecily, who had been reading the card over her mother's shoulder, was already smiling the smile of a woman revising her own story to include a crown. Eleanor said nothing. She had a quality that was in equal parts strength and habit. She did not claim what had not been offered. She thought, briefly and without permission, of those 3 seconds at the end of a long table. Then she went to ensure the drawing-room was prepared for Thursday's call. She ordered the good china. She arranged the flowers herself. She polished with her own hands the silver that had grown dull from neglect, because it mattered that the house presented well, even if her reasons for caring about it were mixed up with things she would not name. Thursday came cold and clear, the autumn sky a hard, particular blue that hurt to look at directly. Prince Aldrich arrived precisely on time, which she could have predicted. He was, she thought, the kind of man for whom precision was a form of respect. He came with only one attendant, a quiet man who positioned himself at the door and did not introduce himself. The prince himself entered the drawing-room with the contained efficiency of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his arrival, and he sat when invited to sit, and he accepted the tea that Eleanor poured with a brief, grave nod. Lady Miriam was at her most polished. Cecily was radiant. She had taken particular care with herself, and the care showed, and Eleanor had helped with the small ivory buttons at her back, without being asked and without being thanked. And then the prince set down his teacup and said, with the directness of a man who had decided to stop circling, "I wonder if I might speak privately with Miss Eleanor Waverley." The room froze. It was one of those moments that stretches itself, that refuses to resolve cleanly into the next thing. And Eleanor, who was standing near the window, felt the whole drawing-room turn toward her in a unified motion of pure shock. She looked at the prince. He was looking only at her. "Of course," she said before anyone else could speak. What followed was a brief, formal, deeply unusual conversation in the smaller sitting room down the hall, while Lady Miriam's face beyond the closed door communicated a range of emotions that Eleanor could only imagine. The prince sat with his back straight and his hands quiet in his lap, the stillness of someone who carried a great deal of internal weight and had learned to keep it contained. He said, without preamble or apology, "You are wondering why I asked for you?" "Yes," Eleanor said. She had seated herself across from him, her own hands folded, her expression composed, because composure was what she had. "I observed you at dinner," he said. "More than you may have realized. You sat at the far end of the table, and you said very little, and you attended to Lady Constance with a patience that was not servility, but genuine kindness. I noticed the difference." He paused, and she saw in that pause the shape of a man who chose his words with deliberation, who did not often speak this plainly, and was doing so now because he had decided it was necessary. "I also overheard," he said more quietly, "what your half-sister said in the corridor. I was returning from a conversation with Lord Ashmore, and I heard most of it. I want you to know that." Eleanor was still. "Why?" she said. "Because I want you to understand," he said, "that my request this afternoon is not made in ignorance of your situation, or in ignorance of what is said about you. I want you to know that I am not operating under any illusion about what others see when they look at you. I am telling you what I see." A pause fell between them. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence of two people who were being careful with something fragile. "I am in need of a wife," he said then, matter-of-factly, in the tone a man might use to explain a mathematical necessity. "The reasons are complex, and some of them are not mine to share at this moment. But I am in a position where the decision must be made before the new year, and I have spent the weeks since my return attending a great many events and finding that the qualities I most require are precisely the ones most absent from the women presented to me. I am not looking for a performance," he said. "I am looking for someone who is real." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking, Miss Waverley, whether you would consider the position. You would have time to think. I would not press you for an answer today. But I wanted to ask you myself, in person, without intermediaries, because I thought you deserved at least that." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at the weathered, serious face, at the eyes that were, she could now confirm, a dark and particular shade of winter grey. "Why did you choose me?" she asked. "Over Cecily, I mean. Most men. I know what most men do," he said. "I am telling you what I do. I chose to ask you because I believe that a woman who has run a household on diminished means, who has held her dignity while being told she has none, who can be kind to an old woman at the corner of a table without expecting to be seen doing it, that woman has the qualities I require far more than any amount of beauty or social acclaim." He paused. "I would also add," he said, and something shifted very slightly in his expression, not quite a smile, the almost of one, "that I think you are more remarkable than you have been permitted to know." Eleanor sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "I will consider it. You said I could have time." "You can," he said, "as much as you need." She looked out the window at the hard, blue sky. Then she looked back at him. "I don't need very long," she said. "I accept." He looked at her, a look of sharp attention, of something that might have been relief. "May I ask why?" "Because you saw me," she said simply. "That is not a small thing." The quiet between them settled then into something different, not comfortable exactly, but honest. And in the hall, she knew, Lady Miriam was waiting, and Cecily was waiting, and the world was waiting to rearrange itself around a fact it had not anticipated. Eleanor Waverley stood, smoothed her grey skirts with her capable, often cold hands, and went to face it. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." The engagement was announced before the week was out, and the announcement moved through the county with the speed of things that no one can quite believe. Eleanor heard it discussed at two separate morning calls that she attended in her customary role as accessory, standing slightly apart, holding the extra gloves, refilling the tea, and she registered, without particular emotion, that the predominant response was not scandal, but bewilderment. People could accept cruelty. They could accept caprice. What they found most difficult to absorb was a choice they could not account for. Lady Miriam did not speak to Eleanor for 3 days. Cecily spoke to her, but only once, and what she said was clipped and bright and carefully imprecise, in a way that conveyed perfectly clearly that she found the entire situation an offence she had not yet found the language to adequately describe. Eleanor noted both responses, filed them, and focused on the practicalities. The letter to be written to Prince Aldrich's household secretary, the questions of timing and announcement, the matter of what she was to wear. She owned nothing appropriate. This was a fact she confronted without self-pity, as she confronted most facts, and she was preparing herself for a quiet conversation with her allowance when a package arrived on the 4th day. It came from a dressmaker she did not know, in a city she rarely visited, and inside, wrapped in silver paper and tied with ribbon the colour of winter sky, was a gown unlike anything she had ever possessed. It was not the fashion, not the pale, innocent colours of debutante white or the bright, sharp hues of competition. It was a deep, twilight blue-green, the colour of the sea at dusk, with a quality of depth that changed slightly as the light shifted, and it was made for a woman with exactly her proportions and no one else's. There was a card. It read, in a hand she recognized from Thursday's formal communication, "For being seen." She sat with the gown across her lap for a long time, in the grey afternoon light of her room, and she did not cry, because she had practice at not crying, but the thing in her chest was large and complicated and warm. The marriage took place quietly, in the small chapel of a royal residence outside the city, 6 weeks after the dinner at Ashmore. Eleanor wore the twilight gown. Lady Constance, who turned out to be Prince Aldrich's great-aunt on his mother's side, a fact no one had mentioned and everyone should have anticipated, attended and said, when she saw Eleanor, "Good, you'll do." She said it in the tone of a woman delivering a verdict that matters, and Eleanor understood it to be the highest possible endorsement. Prince Aldrich. Aldrich, she said to herself, and the name felt momentous in her private mind, like a key turning in a lock, stood at the chapel's altar with the particular quality of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not expected to arrive, and was not entirely certain what to do with the fact that he was grateful. He watched her come down the aisle, not with the performative appreciation of a man acknowledging that he has acquired something beautiful, but with attention, with the real attention of someone who is looking at a specific person and seeing them. It was, she thought, the most continuous she had ever been made to feel. After the ceremony there was a dinner, small, formal, conducted under the eyes of people who were still adjusting their expectations of her and of him, and he seated her at his right, and he called her Eleanor for the first time in the presence of others, and she heard the name in his voice as though he had given it back to her. The estate to which they travelled the following morning was called Harwick Hall, and it was 3 hours north, and it was, as she had been told, though the telling had not quite prepared her for the reality, enormous. Not merely large, vast in the manner of places that had been built over centuries by people for whom scale was a kind of argument. Its stones were grey and clean and very old. Its windows were tall and curtained in heavy dark fabric. Its corridors were hung with portraits of people whose expressions were almost uniformly severe, as though the Harwick line had regarded cheerfulness as a form of instability. The housekeeper, Mrs. Farron, met them at the door with a correctness so complete it was nearly architectural. The indoor staff was assembled in 2 lines, and they looked, Eleanor thought, like people who had been told to expect one thing and been given another, and were waiting to see which version of events would prove correct. She learned their names. All of them. It took the better part of the first morning, and she asked about each person with genuine curiosity. How long had they been in service? What were their particular responsibilities? Was the East Wing's boiler as troublesome as the sound it made suggested? And she saw in their faces the slow, careful recalibration of people realizing that the adjustment they had expected to endure might be something different entirely. The house was cold. Not merely temperatured, it was cold in the way of houses that have not been inhabited with warmth in a long time, where the absence of noise and laughter and argument has crept into the walls and settled there. Eleanor discovered this gradually, in the way one discovers the character of any large and complicated thing, by moving through it, paying attention, letting it show her what it was. The East Wing was entirely under dust covers. She asked about it. Mrs. Farron's pause before answering was a sentence in itself. "His Royal Highness prefers it closed," she said. "His mother's rooms are in the East Wing." Eleanor did not press. She noted it the way she noted everything, carefully without comment, and she went instead to consider the dining room, which contained a table of such extraordinary length that she and Aldrich, when they dined together that first week, were separated by approximately 12 feet of polished mahogany and 3 silver candelabras. She observed this situation for 2 evenings. On the 3rd morning she spoke to the housekeeper. "The dining table," she said. "Is it possible to use only a portion of it?" Mrs. Farren blinked. "I believe so, ma'am. We have leaves that can be removed." "Then I would like to remove most of them," Eleanor said. "Leave enough for 4 at most." When she arrived at dinner that evening, the table was perhaps a quarter of its former length, and she and Aldrich were separated by a distance that admitted of actual conversation. He looked at the shortened table for a moment. "Your idea," he said. It was not a question. "It seemed impractical," she said. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, the almost of one. He sat, and they dined, and they talked for the first time without the architecture of the room working against them. He was, she discovered, considerably different from the figure he presented to the world. He was precise and dry and rather wry, with a particular sense of humour that was so quiet it was easy to miss entirely if one were not attending carefully. He asked her questions, real questions, not social decorations, and he listened to her answers with the full quality of his attention, which was substantial. He told her that first month very little about himself. She did not push. She was not unfamiliar with grief kept behind closed doors. She recognized the architecture of it. She warmed the house instead. She ordered fires in the rooms they actually used. She replaced the dark dining-room curtains with something lighter. She found, in a glass house at the edge of the east garden, a collection of roses that had been allowed to go to seed, tended by a near, silent groundskeeper named Hewitt, who had kept them alive out of some private loyalty to a memory he did not name. She asked Hewitt's advice about them, and he was so startled at being consulted that he said 4 sentences in a row, which Mrs. Farren later told her was unprecedented. Eleanor worked in the rose garden when the weather allowed. The cold did not particularly bother her. She wore the gloves that were warm rather than fashionable, and she learned the names of the varieties, and she cut back what needed cutting and watered what needed water, and she did not romanticize the work, because she had done work all her life and understood it as the most honest form of care. It was in the rose garden, 6 weeks after their arrival, that Aldrich found her. He came around the corner of the glass house in the early afternoon with the purposeful step of a man who has decided something and then reconsidered it, and he stopped when he saw her, kneeling in the turned earth with a pair of pruning shears, and he stood for a moment in a way that was not his usual self-possession but something more complicated. "My mother planted these," he said. She looked up at him. "I know," she said. "Hewitt told me." He was quiet. "I would have had them taken out," he said. "When I first came back, I gave the order and then rescinded it and didn't explain why." "I'm glad you did," she said. "They're extraordinary. The Harwick rose, the pale yellow one in the corner, is nearly extinct outside of these gardens. There are perhaps 3 other specimens in the country." He came to stand beside her, looking at the roses with an expression that was not entirely manageable. "My mother used to spend her mornings here," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned her. Eleanor sat back on her heels and gave him the full weight of her attention, without making it a demand. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I was abroad when she died. I could not. There were reasons, obligations, a situation that I still cannot speak about publicly. I was not here. I did not come home in time. And I have not—" He stopped. "I have not managed to be in this house with any peace since that." Eleanor looked at the roses, at the pale yellow one in the corner, which was budding despite the season, obstinate and quiet and surviving. "You came here today?" she said. He looked down at her. "Yes," he said, "I did." That evening he told her the rest of it. He told her about the diplomatic posting, the impossible situation, the decision that had kept him abroad when every instinct had told him to come home, the guilt that had followed him back to England, and taken up residence in the east wing of Harwick Hall. He told her these things in the sitting room they had made a habit of sharing after dinner, in front of the fire she had ensured was always lit, and she listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interruption, without the urge to fix or diminish or redirect. When he finished, there was a silence, and then she said, "It was not your fault. There is an argument to be made. There is always an argument to be made." She said, "That does not make it the truth." He looked at her for a long time. "Eleanor," he said, and the name in his voice was a different thing now than it had been at the altar, less formal, more careful, as though it had become something he was protective of. She held his gaze and did not look away. "Aldrich," she said, saying his name for the first time, without the ceremony of earlier weeks, and it felt, as she had imagined it would feel, as she had not permitted herself to imagine, like a key turning. The wall did not dissolve, but a door opened in it. That was enough for now. That was more than she had believed she would ever have. The scandal came in January, as scandals generally do, in the bleakest part of the season, when there is little else to discuss, and the cold makes everyone simultaneously bored and mean. It arrived in the form of a letter, read aloud at a dinner Eleanor and Aldrich had attended in the city, by a young man named Pembroke, who had the look of someone who was terrified of the thing he was doing and intended to do it anyway. The letter purported to be a private correspondence between Eleanor and a man named, the name was invented she understood immediately, a complete invention, detailing an arrangement that had been ongoing before her marriage, and, the letter implied, continued afterward. It was not a sophisticated fabrication. The handwriting was wrong. The vocabulary was wrong. The emotional register was wrong in ways that would have been obvious to anyone who had spent more than an hour in her company. But it did not need to be sophisticated. It needed only to exist, to be read, to be heard by the assembled dinner party, which included 3 members of the press and approximately 40 people who would carry the story outward like a contagion before morning. Eleanor sat very still as the letter was read. She had a practice for moments like these, a long and hard-won practice, and she drew on it now. She did not reach for her husband's hand, though she was aware of him beside her, and she did not speak, and her face did not change. She watched Pembroke read the letter with the expression of a man performing bravery and managing only fear, and she thought, someone set him to this. Someone with more to lose than he has. She looked once, briefly across the table to where Cecily sat. Cecily, who had arrived in the city for the season 2 weeks prior, who had found her footing in society with the bright, aggressive energy of someone reasserting a narrative. And she saw in Cecily's face the particular expression of someone watching a performance they have arranged, not gloating, waiting. Cecily had never been stupid. She knew that the moment called for a held breath, not a smile. Eleanor turned back to Pembroke and waited for him to finish. When he did, there was a terrible, charged silence, the kind of silence a room makes when everyone in it is rapidly recalculating. And in that silence, Eleanor heard Aldrich move. He did not stand immediately. He set down his glass with the controlled deliberateness of a man deciding something very precisely. And then he rose, and the room turned toward him with the unified, involuntary attention of people in the presence of authority they had momentarily forgotten. "Mr. Pembroke," Aldrich said. His voice was absolutely even. It was the most frightening version of even, the kind that is the surface of something enormous and very still. "I am acquainted with your family. I am acquainted with your father's debts, which are substantial, and with the arrangement that has recently been reached regarding them." He paused. Pembroke had gone white. "I wonder," Aldrich continued, in the same absolutely even tone, Whether you would care to tell this room who offered to relieve your father's financial situation in exchange for the service you have just performed. The silence had a different quality now. Pembroke looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked very briefly across the room in the direction of Cecily's chair, and Eleanor watched Cecily become very still in the way of someone who has made a miscalculation. "I see," said Aldrich, though Pembroke had said nothing. He looked at his wife then, at Eleanor, who had not moved, whose face had not changed, whose hands were folded in her lap with the infinite steadiness of someone who has had a great deal of practice at being still, and something in his expression shifted. It was not a soft expression. It was the expression of a man who has made a decision and is entirely certain of it. He crossed the room. It was perhaps 30 feet. He crossed it past the favoured beauties and the titled guests and the astonished faces of people revising their understanding of this prince who was supposed to be cold, and he stopped beside Eleanor's chair and he offered her his hand. She took it and stood, and he turned to the room. "My wife," said Prince Aldrich in a voice that carried to every corner without being raised, "is the most honest person in this room. That is a quality I am not equipped to say enough about, and so I will say only this. I chose her. I chose her not because I was persuaded, not because I was presented with no alternative, not because I required someone quiet and useful and easily managed. I chose her because I watched her sit at the far end of a table where she had been placed to be forgotten, and I saw her treat every person in her vicinity with a generosity that cost her nothing except the effort of being genuine. I chose her because I overheard what her own family said of her, and I heard her say nothing in return, and I understood that her silence was not submission, but dignity. I chose her." And here his voice shifted, very slightly, into something that was no longer a speech but a confession, because she is the only person in my acquaintance who has looked at me without wanting anything from me that I was not willing to give, and I find that I am not prepared to stand in a room and allow that woman to be made small by people who are afraid of her. He looked once at Cecily. It was not a long look. It did not need to be. "The letter is a fabrication," he said. "I expect that to be understood clearly before this evening concludes." He did not wait for a response. He guided Eleanor from the room with his hand at her back, and she went, her head level, her face composed, her spine straight, as it had always been, in every room where she had been invisible, and the door closed behind them, and the night beyond it was very cold and very clear. In the carriage afterward, neither of them spoke for a long time. The city moved past the windows in its winter darkness, the lamps making islands of amber in the black, and Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap, and her heart doing something she could not quite categorize. He was sitting across from her, and his expression had settled back into itself, the composed, weathered face she had come to understand as his usual surface. But there was something different in it tonight, a kind of undone quality, like a man who has said more than he planned and is not certain what it means that he has said it. "You should have let me speak," she said eventually. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I am capable of speaking for myself," she said. "I know that," he said. "I did not do it because you were incapable." He was quiet for a moment. "I did it because I could not do it," he said. "I understand the difference." She looked at him across the dark carriage. "Aldrich," she said. "I know." He said, "Eleanor." And that was all. The carriage moved through the dark city, and the lamps came and went, and she watched his face in the brief intervals of light, and she thought, "Here, this is the place where the world stops being the shape it has always been and becomes a different shape entirely." Cecily left the city within the week. The story that circulated, and several of the more careful papers corrected it, was that she had chosen to spend the remainder of the season abroad, visiting friends in the south of France. The correction was accepted as corrections generally are, with more efficiency than enthusiasm. Pembroke's family's debts were settled through channels that asked nothing of Eleanor and nothing further of Pembroke, who retired to the country and ceased to be relevant. Lady Constance, who had attended the dinner as a guest of another party and had witnessed the entire scene with the expression of someone watching a chess game unfold exactly as she had calculated it would, stopped Eleanor at the door as she and Aldrich were leaving and said, "Well done." "I didn't do anything," Eleanor said. "No," said Lady Constance. "You let him. That requires more courage than most people have." She patted Eleanor's hand once, with the brusque warmth of a woman who has decided someone is worth the gesture, and then she went back inside. The world adjusted, as worlds do when the structure of a story shifts beneath them. Slowly, and then with increasing speed, the narrative resettled around a different shape. The prince who had chosen the overlooked woman, who had crossed a room to defend her, who was said, by those who had seen them together since, to be a different man than the cold, isolated figure who had returned from abroad. The papers were cautious. They noted the change without claiming to understand it. Lady Constance, when asked, said, "He found someone worth being warm for." And then, in the spring of the following year, Eleanor opened the East Wing. She did not make it an occasion. She simply, one morning in March, went to find Mrs. Farren and asked her to have the dust covers removed. Mrs. Farren was quiet for a long moment. "All of them, ma'am?" "Yes," Eleanor said, "and the windows opened when the day allows for it. The rooms should have air." The work took 3 days. On the evening of the 3rd day she found Aldrich standing in the doorway of his mother's sitting room, looking at the uncovered furniture, at the chairs that had been her chairs, the desk that had been her desk, the small glass cabinet full of things she had collected, with an expression that wasn't quite pain and was not quite release, but was somehow both at the same time. Eleanor came to stand beside him. She did not speak immediately. They stood together in the doorway of the room that had been closed, and the evening light came through the unshuttered window and lay across the floor in long gold strips, and somewhere in the garden below, through the open window she could hear it, a bird was doing something purposeful in the newly turned soil of the rose bed. "She would have liked you," Aldrich said finally. "I think I would have liked her," Eleanor said. He looked at her. In the gold evening light, in the opened room, something in his face was different. The composure was still there. It was not the sort of thing a man shed entirely, but it was no longer armor. It was more like the frame of a house that has finally been given its interior, filled in and real. He put his arm around her. She leaned into it, into him, into the warmth of a man who had been very cold for a very long time, and was learning, with patience and practice, and the specific influence of her quiet, persistent presence, to be otherwise. They stood in the doorway of his mother's room until the light changed. Then they went down together to dinner, through a house that was warm and bright, and full of the sound of people who were glad to be in it. 1 year later, Harwick Hall had been transformed in the way that houses are transformed when someone decides to stop treating them as monuments to grief and begins treating them as homes. The rose garden was in full flower by May. The Harwick rose, in particular, that stubborn, pale yellow variety, had spread along the southern wall in a way that Hewitt called unprecedented and Eleanor called expected, because she had believed in it from the beginning. The dining table, permanently shortened, seated 4 comfortably and 6 in a press. Mrs. Farren had thawed to the point of occasionally smiling, which the rest of the staff treated as a natural wonder of roughly the same magnitude as a solar eclipse. Lady Constance came to stay in June and did not leave until September, which no one had anticipated and everyone was, on balance, glad of. She sat in the garden every afternoon and said exactly what she thought about everything, which Eleanor found bracing and Aldrich had learned to find affectionate. And on a morning in late July, in the room that had been Eleanor's mother-in-law's favourite room, the east sitting room, with its tall windows and its restored pale curtains, and its view of the garden where the roses were doing their quiet, extraordinary work. Eleanor sat in the chair by the window, with a small and extremely new person in her arms, and the sunlight came through the glass and lay across them both, and she felt, for the first time in her life, not the absence of things, but the presence of them. Aldrich came in quietly, which he always did. He had that quality of moving without announcement, and he stood in the doorway a moment before she heard him, and she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she had learned, over the course of a year, to read. Not quite a smile. The most of one. She held out her free hand, and he crossed the room, past everything else, past all the furniture and the history and the weight of a great old house become a home, and he took it. They did not need to speak. Some things have no adequate language, and this was one of them. The woman who had been invisible and the man who had been frozen, in a room full of morning light and roses and the small, breathing fact of a future they had made together. And the door to the locked wing standing permanently open, and the season outside the window not an ending, but a beginning, lavish and completely undeserved and entirely theirs. He had not been lucky to find her. He had simply been paying attention. And she, who had survived years of being unseen, who had carried her dignity through rooms that gave her no reason to keep it, who had said yes not for a crown or a title or an escape, but because one person had looked at her and truly looked, she had been seen, at last, completely. And it was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.